Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Sudisha and today I have with me Sridhar. Both of us are working on the Takstashila's 20 million jobs project, wherein we are trying to come up with policies and pretty much painting a policy landscape which can produce 20 million jobs in India per year. Today we're going to analyze a government scheme which has been called the largest social security scheme in the world, which is MGNREGA. It was started in 2005. And it's been considered one of the most successful social security schemes in the world, especially for rural India. It provides 100 days work minimum as per demand, and it tries to create productive assets of prescribed quality and productivity to enhance rural infrastructure. Today, we are going to analyze the objectives, benefits, challenges, shortcomings, and unintended consequences of this scheme. And in the end, we'll try to understand what things need to be changed and what needs to be done differently. So welcome, Sridhar, to the podcast. And I think we'll start with the first thing, which is I would like you to help our listeners understand objectives and benefits of this scheme.
Thank you very much, Sudisha. I think MGNREGA is, like you mentioned, one of the largest social security schemes in the world. And I think for a country of India's size, population, and we're not a rich country, right? By any stretch of imagination, we are not a rich country. Our per capita income is only around $2,000. And therefore, for somebody to have come up with a scheme like this and said that, hey, we need to remove abject poverty in our country. And you can't wait till for the next 50 years before everybody's got enough money and there are resources. We've got to do something and we've got to act now. I think it was in that context that around 2005, this scheme was launched. And in this, over the last 15, 17 years, there have been many naysayers and people who questioned why there was a need for this, etc. But there's a significant amount of money. I think last year we spent about close to 100,000 crores on this project, on this scheme. And today we've got about 73,000 crores, if I'm not mistaken, allotted to MGNREGA. And currently there are about 155 million active workers who are benefiting from the MGNREGA scheme. These people have so far received something like 1.8 billion person days of work. And this scheme works towards providing people with some guarantees work up to 100 days in a year. And it's up to the individual to go and say that I want some MGNREGA work, and the government is supposed to make that possible. And the idea is that not only will this provide a certain amount of wage for 100 days of work, guaranteed amount of work for 100 days to a large section of our rural poor. It is also, the idea also is that while we ask them to do work, the work is not just about some digging some holes, covering up the hole and so on, like some skeptics suggest. But the objective was to build and create durable assets towards water conservation, drought proofing, irrigation, land development, water harvesting, flood control, and rural connectivity, right? So that these people have access to markets and so on. But the early years were really spent on setting up the program architecture, etc. But I think it would be wrong to suggest that no assets have been created. Some have. But the other benefit has been many, right? I mean, Sudisha, do you want to sort of talk about what the benefits of the scheme have been so far and with respect to the objectives?
Yeah, thanks, Sridhar. So I think that there have been multiple benefits. And before I get to that, I think it's very important to understand the kind of people who are looking for this work, right? So, I mean, thanks to People's Archive of Rural India, which is started by P. Sainath, I've been able to read multiple individual stories of people who are reliant on MGNREGA work. So from my research and from my experience of working in a bank, which was almost 5 years ago, as it turns out, it's almost always the people from the tribal communities and people from lower castes and class who are looking for this kind of work. And that's mostly because, they are dependent on intermittent work in general. So let's say the Manrega scheme did not exist. They were reliant on seasonal farming, and let's say something is being developed in their villages. So they go and they participate for maybe 20 days of work, and then they have nothing left. So a scheme like this definitely provides them with a social security net that they can rely on when nothing else is available. The Manrega is often the last resort that is left for them. And I think that's a great benefit to have, right? It's a great security to have in their lives. So that's definitely the one, that this scheme provides some sort of guarantee to them. The second one would be that this scheme definitely empowers women. And I think that, maybe it's conjecture at this point, but I think that no other scheme in India has provided women as much freedom and independence as this scheme, simply because when you look at intermittent work that I pointed out earlier, it's mostly the men who get this work over women. And this is something that we've pointed out and written about extensively in our document on women's labor force participation. So a good example would be that, let's say a machine is introduced to a farm. A farmer, is able to buy a new machine for harvesting. It will be mostly the men who get the opportunity to operate them. And that completely removes the role of women from the system. So I think this scheme is able to help the women get work when nothing else is available for them. And a good example that I read was in Bangla Medu in Tamil Nadu, where there is a tribal community called Irula. And they do small jobs around Tamil Nadu, which includes maybe picking groundnut crops or digging canals, right? But over the years, the availability of these small jobs have decreased, and it's mostly the men who are able to get them. But the women, they paint a very positive picture about Manrega, of this community, simply because all these men are able to get the jobs that they were previously getting. But now Manrega is being able to provide them guaranteed jobs. That's another thing, that, women
that's wonderful,
are,
right?
yeah.
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 So, and I was just saying, I was just agreeing with you. And I'm saying, that's wonderful that, women are getting benefited significantly through this scheme. And like we've discussed, you and I, Sudisha, that when money goes into the hands of women, they spend it on improving the lives of their families in a way that, very often, unfortunately, men do not. They provide better food to their children, they help them to get educated, and it sort of goes a long way in improving long-term well-being of rural families. I just wanted to add that. I agree with you and just say that. Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, that's actually the beauty of this. So there's a survey which is done in 2009 by MGNREGS and Ritika Khera, two very popular economists in India who almost everyone knows about. And in that survey, they were able to find that 38% of the surveyed women said that Manrega provided them with money that they used exclusively to send their children to schools. So, a conjecture would be that because the women are able to find guaranteed work and the men are anyway expected to work, in an Indian household, the household burden chore would have fallen on the elder daughter's shoulder, or maybe even the younger if they have an elder son. But as it turns out, through this survey and through several other studies, the women have used the money to send all their children to schools. No child has been exclusively selected for the household burden chore. So the women have not only worked under this scheme, they've also come back home and done the household chores and used that money to send their children to schools. So I think that's like an unexpected outcome of this scheme, and it really fascinated me.
Yeah.
Then,
and I wanted to add a few more.
Yeah. No, Sridhar, you continue. I would like to know your thoughts on that.
No, I think this is great. And I wanted to also point out, besides the fact that there are people who have been sort of saying that, the impact of Manrega work has been only to dig some holes, etc. I was reading an interesting article written by Sudha Narayan from the Indira Gandhi Institute of Development Research. And she talks about 4 areas in which four dimensions of impacts that MGNREGA assets can be regarded to have created. And the first one, she says, is it's augmenting rural incomes through investments in rural livelihoods. So she gives anecdotal information, right? She talks about how in Tamil Nadu, the Department of Fisheries has done something around, are able to look at poultry sheds being built or fish ponds being built under MGNREGA, and are also helping farmers, improve rearing of cattle, poultry, etc. So I think that's something that's happening. But sometimes there's also marketing arrangements which are in place, which helps them to go out and sell their produce. So this way, it's actually augmenting their income. The second thing that she talks about is about augmenting productivity of agriculture through investments in land and water. In water seems to be an area where a large part of the MGNREGA money seems to have been going towards those assets which are created. But they are about in Kadapa district in Andhra Pradesh, which is generally prone to a lot of drought. She says a massive network of contoured trenches along the hill axis, increased availability and irrigation. So I was just quoting Sudha in this article. And she's also talking about how in Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir, MGNREGA has funded an intensive network of schools where and again, North Andamans has and then the third one is about and she says it's not just that. The third dimension she talks about is about building resilience. So she talks about how in Tamil Nadu alone, some 5.8 million saplings have been planted with a survival rate of rain of about 75%. And similarly in Chhattisgarh, Andhra Pradesh and Telangana, they have planted lots of trees along the highway and the roadside, and which also have impressive survival rates between 60 and 80%. And she talks about how it's also helping protecting against tsunami, coastal erosion through planting mangroves, etc., which is happening, which otherwise may not have happened. I think that's the point that she's trying to make. The kind of as some of the assets which have been created may not have been created if MGNREGA had not been there. So this is something that she points out and talks about the benefits of MGNREGA.
Yeah, that's a great point. And in fact, this is what I have also read that, MGNREGA has led to creation of sustainable rural assets, water conservation, forestry, especially in states like Bihar, for example. So I covered this in our earlier podcast that half of the Bihar is prone to floods and half of the Bihar is prone to droughts. And the one thing that the state really needs is a defense against that. So, projects like MGNREGA have helped in that. And I just want to point out the last benefit before we take a break and come to the next point. MGNREGA has led to financial inclusion of beneficiary to Indian economy, because we know that in 2017 the whole process was digitized, and that has led to all the laborers who work under this scheme, they've had to make an account in a bank, and that's where their wages come, and that's how they get their wages. So this entire process has led to digitization and financial inclusion of a lot of people in India. There are some caveats to that. So before we come to the next point, let's take a short break. Okay, we're back. So we've covered the objectives and the benefits. Sridhar, I would like you to point out some of the challenges you think that are associated with the scheme.
Yeah, I think the benefit has definitely been around, like you mentioned. To summarize some of the benefits, I think there is reduction in rural poverty because of people getting at least some amount of work. There is benefit. Women have disproportionately been benefited on this program, and that has led to big benefits for large number of rural households. Maybe there is a wage floor which has been created on account of this. Therefore, overall agricultural wage is also known to have gone up by about 5.3%. So I think some of these have been great benefits. On the other hand, I think while we Sudha's note talked about how there are all these anecdotal examples. She gave some nice examples of work which has been done to augment rural income, improve productivity of agriculture through investment in land and water, building resilience through greening initiatives, and management of natural disasters, right? So these are all good anecdotal things. But there have been some people who have questioned this, right? So I was reading an interesting article written by Jagdish Bhagwati and Arvind Panagaria, and they had questioned MGNREGA and its benefits and said that, they look at it from two, three different points of view. One, they say, okay, you're paying a certain amount of wage, and you're saying that you're paying them, you're raising the rural wage, the floor wage, right? But you say, like, yeah, so which means that these people are not working in those, let's say 130 rupees is what MGNREGA pays and 80 rupees is what they would have earned otherwise. So it's basically like 50 rupees is what the farmer is benefiting with, but the government is spending 130 rupees to provide 50 rupees worth of benefit. That's their sort of take on on the money aspect. The second point they make is that there is quality of assets which have been created are remarkably poor, and there is not a good credible estimate of the overall value of the assets created. If, say, hundreds of thousands of crores have been spent over the last decade and a half on MGNREGA, do we have like some concrete evidence of, like, the kind of infrastructure, rural infrastructure, which has been created using them? And I think that data is definitely lacking. I was looking at the MGNREGA website also, and if you want to go and find out, like, what assets have been created in what place, etc., it's really hard to find out. They have like data by some district level, etc., and then within that the taluk, and then you have to get some, and then you have to aggregate all this. And even there, I don't think there's a value given to, I mean, let's say you've dug a canal. Now, is this work, you've spent 10 crores in digging this canal. Now, is the canal worth 10 crores, right? Is it worth only 50 lakhs? So that's not very clear. So the value of the assets created is not very clear. And some states definitely have taken a little more interest in creating assets and using this as an opportunity, while many other states have not. Most states have paid scant attention to asset creation and have focused just on providing work. The people, they also talk about the fact that this money is being spent at a village level, which is like, very, and small amounts of money are being spent in each village. And so high quality assets are not created. And even those assets which are created are often not very useful. And even if they're useful, they're not well maintained over time, because the next year they may go and do something else. Therefore, like Kaushik Basu, for instance, suggested that why don't you take the money which is allotted to MGNREGA and give 60% of it as cash transfer and use 40% of the money to actually create useful assets, right? So that's like, there are some people who feel this way. And there are some big farmers who crib that, they're not getting workers now. The work ethic of these people has become poor. The people whom they were able to exploit and, like, get them to work for very low wages now are demanding higher wages and better working conditions. And, and so they're complaining that, like, they're not doing it. So I think these are some of the problems, right? I mean, basically, my biggest takeaway from this is, yes, we are providing employment, we are helping to reduce rural poverty, but a lot more could be done with this money if we were to create good quality assets, and actions in that area will make a big difference. What are your thoughts on this, Sudisha?
So thanks, Sridhar, for summing up the points on shortcomings. And I think I would like to add on that one of the things that's pointed out repeatedly about, the shortcomings of MGNREGA is that it has a pretty low wage rate. And there are implications to that here and there. But I think that, for, like I said, that MGNREGA is often the last resort for people, especially for tribal communities and Dalit communities who are looking for work. So by that point, you have to understand that, they've already run out of their savings and any other opportunities that they can capitalize on. So I think that one of the things that economists are constantly saying is that the wage rate needs to go up a bit. That's one. Another is regular payment delays. And this is something that I've observed firsthand, and it wasn't pretty at all when I was working as a business associate in Bank of Baroda a couple of years ago. And almost every other day, the queue for, people who wanted to get some money were full of these MGNREGA laborers who used to stand in line for hours and just to check whether the money has come to their accounts or not. And a lot of times the money hadn't come to their accounts. So this is a delay that I've seen firsthand, and which exists a lot of times. I previously talked about the women in Bangladesh and Tamil Nadu. I was reading about their story, and they pointed out that they have to walk 4 kilometers to the nearest bank where their account is to check if the payment has come and to get the wages. But as it turns out, that 8 kilometer walk is totally futile most of the times, simply because the money hasn't come yet. And that ties to, the third shortcoming that I would like to talk about which is that there are administrative lapses on the ground. So what happens is that when you think of the MGNREGA system as like a trickle down system, so the center pours in money to these schemes, and then this money is allocated to the state governments, and the state governments pass this money to the local panchayats and the local administrative staff that exists. And these people are responsible for carrying on this entire operation of employing these laborers, of making sure that their attendance is marked, and of also making sure that they get the compensation for their work. Now, all of this requires a lot of administrative work. It requires scanning of documents. It requires doing everything perfectly, right? Making sure that the attendance is marked as accurately as possible. And also adding to that, a lot of this also requires everything to be done on time. But as we know, and as the adage goes in India, that, if it's government work, it's going to be delayed. A lot of administrative lapses happen on the ground. Documents are not scanned on time. Attendances are not marked accurately. Compensation is not done perfectly. So a lot of these things happen. And how the government chooses to punish the miscreants in this is by stopping the allocation of money. So because of the administrative lapses, it's often the laborers who get affected because of this entire problem, right? They don't get money. They don't get compensation for their labor simply because the administration and the administrative staff failed to complete their work. So that's quite unfortunate, and that's something.
So while you were speaking, I was looking at some data. The MGNREGA website has a dashboard, and it gives you some 40 different metrics which are measured. And one of them is the last one, in fact, the number 41 is percentage payments generated within 15 days. And they claim that it used to be about 89.61, 2018-19. And currently it's at about 95%, right? They're saying 95% of the payments are generated within 15 days. Now, I mean, if this data is wrong, it's wrong. But if 95% is done, it's not terrible, right? So number one, right? I think the second one you talked about on the wages themselves being low, and there's a need to sort of increase the MGNREGA wage. I think, yes, absolutely. I think MGNREGA wages should be sort of increased on a regular basis, keeping in mind the ground realities. And compared to last year, I think the budget for this year is lower, but the government claims that since COVID is on the wane, the demand for MGNREGA work will sort of go down, and therefore they can do. That's a little hard to accept because as it stands, there's a significant unmet demand of MGNREGA work. Lots of people, at least 10 million people or more, are looking for work and have not got it, right? And even the government's own statements show that a significant percentage of people who have applied for work they've not been able to give them work, right? So I think that is one. So I think some of these things are true. I agree with you, but I'm not sure about how much the wage can be increased by at this current point in time. So my view here is that if you're able to demonstrate better quality of assets being created using MGNREGA work, it would be easier to go out and get more money for MGNREGA. I think if the quality of assets produced and like data around what assets have been created using MGNREGA remain scarce, it's going to be very hard to generate and provide more money for the scheme, right? I think that's going to be the reality. And that's my view. I mean, what do you say, Sudisha?
No, I agree. I mean, obviously, without proper econometric models, it's hard for us to predict what the wage increase needs to be. And I think in the last 3 years with the COVID pandemic, we are kind of like in a vicious cycle where this scheme needs more money than ever. but at the same time, we don't have enough money to fund it. So spillovers are happening and there's less budget allocation. So, it's hard for me at least to predict what the wage should be to break this cycle and what can be done. But yeah, there is a problem. That's definitely something I'm acknowledging. And yeah.
Yeah, but I think if you look at this document, which was written by Shilp Verma and Tushar Shah, they talk about beyond digging and filling holes. They took some case studies of best performing MGNREGA water assets. They say that 50% of all the MGNREGA money seems to have gone towards building some water related assets. And therefore, they've gone and studied some of those real good successes. And they're saying if others were also to do something similar, then they could benefit quite significantly and get good returns from the money which is being invested on MGNREGA. So they've come up with some 6, 7 propositions and say the first one, they say pick the low hanging fruits first. So basically identify simple things that can be done quickly, requiring like low levels of skill, etc., and which will provide significant annual economic returns, right? So they talk about in Bihar, they talk about cleaning of irrigation canals and channels, desilting and deepening of tanks and ponds, and so on. Similarly, they're saying like keep MGNREGA demand driven, understand where it is required, where more is required, and ensure that is done. It should, the administration itself needs to understand that there is a difference between MGNREGA and other generally central sponsored schemes. The Sarpanch seems to be viewing this as an opportunity to gain political mileage and enhance their social clout at the expense of the government of India. So they said that, this needs to be done better. So you need to focus on where the demand is and understand which specific labor market is flourishing and where there is greater demand, and make sure that those places get money for MGNREGA. The third one, they talk about recognize the importance of the assets being created. And that has been my point as well, that, if you don't recognize that this is an opportunity to build sustainable assets which can improve the economy, we are going to run out of money at some point or the other. And it's not enough to, and they say the fourth one, they say it's not enough if you build these assets, fix responsibility for on the Gram Panchayat to regularly maintain these assets which have been created. So I think that's important. So then, you can make sure that these assets useful. Then they're also, you talked about some administrative lapses. They have a couple of points around how to equip the MGNREGA administration, especially in poor areas, and build capacities of where the demand is higher, do that. But they also address one of the points that we talked about earlier, where the better off farmers are complaining that MGNREGA has increased wages. It has created a scarcity of agricultural labor, and they even complain about deteriorating work ethic, etc. So you need to make it not about between the rich and the poor, but one where you start ensuring that the assets that you are building are actually improving the local water security, are enhancing connectivity to input and output markets, and they improve village amenities which are available to everyone, right? Not just the poor. That will help improve the entire agrarian economy and therefore improve the labor market also. So that's their point. Says let's not reduce MGNREGA wages to make it possible. We should not give up the baby with the bathwater. We should make sure that the non-wage benefits are enhanced so that the better off farmers also see a stake in its effective implementation. I think that's basically it. I know to summarize what he says is, and I think I agree completely, is about getting the performance measurement right and plan an exit. So eventually, MGNREGA would be considered successful if the number of people seeking work through MGNREGA goes down, right? So if year on year, they should see a reduction in MGNREGA spending, and they should also see a reduction in demand for MGNREGA. I think that's the key thing there. So how can that happen? It can happen when assets created under MGNREGA are effectively able to, I'm just quoting them, effectively able to enhance the profitability of agriculture by improving land productivity, providing enhanced water security, connecting villages to input and output markets, and improving rural infrastructure. So I think making sure that we calculate the value of the assets being created, identify the right assets which are to be created, ensure that these assets are maintained, then I think the benefits of MGNREGA will be more long term and the need for MGNREGA will go down over time.
Yeah, I think Sridhar, you've covered the points which you were talking about, that the things that the government needs to do differently. And I think we've pretty much covered everything about the scheme. I think I would like to end the podcast with the last segment, which is some of the unintended consequences that have happened because of this scheme. And I think the first one is that, and the listener, I just want to point out that these consequences, when I'm stating those out, there's no positive or negative connotation to that. It depends on the listener on how they want to kind of interpret that. So I think the first one would be that I read somewhere that some of the states in India which share borders with other countries, if the MGNREGA is very successful in those states, and I think this has already happened in some ways. A lot of immigrants from Bangladesh have already been coming to India. Seeing that a scheme like MGNREGA is successful and, them being able to get daily wage jobs here, this scheme can, or probably it already has, increased some immigration in India from these neighboring states, from these neighboring countries. So that's one unintended consequence that has probably happened. There's not enough data to measure that, or it may happen in the future. I think another unintended consequence is that MGNREGA has sort of led to higher wages in rural areas, which is contributing to farm mechanization. And we've covered this in our document and even in this podcast, that whenever there's farm mechanization in India, it's the men who get to benefit from that because they get the opportunity to use that machinery, and the women are kind of sidelined in this entire process. So I think that can have a negative impact on women's labor force participation. It kind of already has. So that's one unintended consequence that's come from this scheme. Another unintended consequence is that, we often talk about how the arts and cultural industry in India is dying out. A lot of the traditional arts are dying out because there's nobody left to buy them, and the skilled workers are also expiring. The skilled workers in the past, in particular arts, now they are enrolling their kids in school who are becoming engineers or teachers or taking up service-based jobs, right? So those arts are dying out. So one unintended consequence is that professions like rural artisans and handloom weavers, etc., they're losing workers to MGNREGA because MGNREGA is easy work. It requires unskilled labor and it's guaranteed. So it's almost always available. So that's one reason that can be considered an unintended consequence. And I think another unintended consequence is that, while you've pointed out in the podcast, and even I've read that, because of MGNREGA, a lot of environmental conservation projects have happened in India, and so many trees have been planted, so many canals have been built, agricultural output has also gone up. But I think I want to point out that this can differ from state to state. So one unintended consequence is that perhaps MGNREGA has led to increased air pollution in Delhi. And this ties out to my unintended consequence point about increased farm mechanization because of MGNREGA. So there is a paper by, I think, Patrick Bearer, who has used data to conclusively prove that because of MGNREGA, farm mechanization has gone up in Punjab and Haryana. And when that happens, agricultural output increases. And when that happens, there is more residue left to burn. So according to his paper, there's been an increase of cropland fires by around 9% to 21% in the current scenario because of MGNREGA. And he's conclusively proven that through that paper. So I think unintended consequence can be that while in some areas, in let's say Tamil Nadu, Kerala, MGNREGA has led to environmental conservation, it can also lead to environmental pollution. So that also needs to be checked. And I think the last unintended consequence I would like to point out is a brilliant article I read, which said that, lured by the lesser effort involved, MGNREGA jobs like digging pits and filling them, they don't need any skills. And because of that, factory workers are actually leaving their factory jobs to join the MGNREGA scheme and do these unskilled labor jobs because they're so easy and they're so readily available. So I think that's another unintended consequence that's been happening for a while. And I would like to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I agree with some of them. I mean, I think the fact that these unintended consequences, whenever you have some policy, there are always going to be some unintended consequences. We need to anticipate them and try to mitigate for them. And taking more stringent action against people who violate environmental norms in terms of burning crop, etc., has to be dealt with. But to me, a rising agricultural wage is a good sign, right? And mechanization of farm work is also a good sign because India has always had some issues with, I mean, if you look at yield per hectare of agriculture in India, for most crops, it's much below global averages. So I think that's important to take into account. And states which use greater mechanization like Punjab, Haryana, etc., have like higher yield per hectare than states which do not. So I think there has to be that carrot and stick approach towards the environment. And we can't throw the baby away with the bathwater, to repeat what I had said earlier, by not doing it. Not doing MGNREGA is not a choice anymore. No political party will have the guts to go and remove a scheme like this. But in fact, it can be strengthened. I think a government with good intentions will find ways of ensuring that the assets created through MGNREGA are really useful and better. And I think if we build more accountability on that, I think some of these things can be dealt with and it can become a really successful program.
Yeah, agreed. And with that, I think we've done a holistic assessment of the MGNREGA scheme, and I think we should end this podcast. So thank you, Sridhar, for joining me. And thanks to anyone who listened to the podcast. And we'll be back with another episode soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takstashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.